Welcome, Crypto Hippies, to the next installment of your favorite drum circle. Today, we're going to discuss borders and how they've been changing and how there's been a lot of yelling about borders, suggestions of how we could change policies and possibly bring borders into the future. So that was totally vague, and that's on purpose. I'm trying to, there's a lot of different topics that touch on this idea of borders that are kind of in the news. The first one is the US-Mexico border thing. We have right now day 23 of the government shutdown in the US over Trump wanting a bunch of money to build a wall.
And that's what the shutdown is about.
Yeah. So Trump says, we want $5.7 billion for our $20 billion wall. We want like a quarter of it. And the Democrats are like, no, we're literally not giving you a cent for your wall. And so, there's $0 on this side and there's $5.7 billion on this side. And somewhere they have to meet so that they can reopen the government. So
everybody was fine with it when Clinton wanted to build his little wall. But Trump, no, it's another story.
Did Clinton build a wall? I didn't remember that one.
Yeah, the Clinton administration, they must have been a huge project because there's a lot of wall along that border, and it's intended to filter people through the desert, like through the most dangerous parts.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear that it's a very politically motivated and even manufactured controversy. You don't have to go back only just a few years to hear politicians on the completely opposite end of the spectrum of where they previously were. I think they set these issues up so that both sides look ridiculous, so that each side can point at the other one and say, look how ridiculous that side is. For example, when we're talking about $5 billion amongst a $1 trillion budget, that's basically nothing. So on the one hand, you've got the Republicans saying, oh, it won't cost us anything. Look, it's a pittance compared to what we spend on everything else. But then, of course, the Republicans look pretty ridiculous since illegal immigration is down. More Hispanics are leaving than are coming. It's just ridiculous any way you slice it.
Is
that really true that more Hispanics are leaving than coming in? Like, I have seen some statistics. It was like from a Pew Poll or something, and people questioned the validity. Because obviously, it's hard to measure something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would be hesitant to really latch on to any statistics as being totally verifiable.
Yeah, but I think it's valid. Like, I think a lot of Mexican Americans would go back to Mexico in this environment.
The statistics that I've read were specifically about Mexican Americans and more Mexicans leaving the U.S. than illegal immigrants from Mexico coming in. I don't know how verifiable that is, but that's what I've read. I haven't heard anything about like more Hispanics leaving than coming in general.
Right.
Oh, yeah, probably Mexicans would be the more correct term.
So borders are a really interesting topic in more libertarian circles because some libertarians are like really in support of borders, even like anarchists, even people who say like we're anarcho-capitalists, but we believe in borders and like solid borders. And I'm like, well, how do you have borders if you don't have a state? And if you need a state, then how can you call yourself an anarchist?
Well, some of them have this idea where it's like a homeowners association. So you have like a community or a town, and maybe there's 1,000, 10,000 people in the town, and they have a border in the town, and it's only people who are vetted who can come in, and it's all this private property collective, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess that view of borders makes sense to me, especially the more local you get. I mean, obviously there are gated communities that are exactly how you just described, where, if you want to buy property in this community, we have to like you, we have to want you to be here. And I think that's totally valid for a small neighborhood. But when you start thinking about the whole country, the whole United States, it's 3,000 miles across and like maybe 1,500 miles high. It's a big piece of land. And is it right for a group of people to say, we own this entire swath of land and, people who don't look like us or whatever can't come in?
I think where a lot of folks are coming from on that is there's a section of NCAPs who will make an argument like, if we want to get to a free society, if we want to get to a libertarian society, then you can only achieve that if you have people in your society with libertarian values. And then they go on to argue that people from other countries, particularly poorer countries, don't have libertarian values, so we need to shut down the borders if we want any chance of achieving freedom in our lifetimes, which is something that I don't agree with. But I think that's mostly where they're coming from. Maybe not from like a long-term ideological, we're ANCAPs, but we like borders. But basically, we should only have Western values in order to promote freedom.
Maybe that's something we could explore a little bit more, because it's a very common argument, this notion that, well, we can't allow people to come here because of how we speculate that they might vote, and I think that there's a lot of problems with that argument, but maybe colloquially it sounds, or rhetorically, it sounds like a good argument, but in reality, like, first of all, non-citizens are not supposed to be voting anyways, right? So if we're trying to at least come from within the paradigm of borders, like non-citizens, those people shouldn't be voting. But then furthermore, it requires the speculation that you assume that you know how these people are going to vote, whether they're going to vote at all.
So I'm not sure that's the exact argument. I think the argument is more like Western civilization produces people who have sort of individualistic values, where they're raised in a way where they're sort of imbued with this culture of sort of fair exchange and capitalism and nonviolence. And people who are raised outside of that culture are not necessarily moral people from the standpoint of Western morality. So I think it's paranoia about foreign cultures' morality. Like, if other people come in, even if they don't have the right to vote, they still might steal stuff, they still might commit crimes, they still might defraud people in business, and things like that. So I think it's, sort of xenophobia about other cultures.
Either way you want to make the argument, whether you're worried about how they're going to come vote or whether you're worried about their values. Again, the response is the same. It requires your speculation that you think what they're going to do. Like, you're speculating, oh, well, I know how all of these people are. You're grouping everyone in a category, and then you're closing down their right to travel, which is something that we had as humans for most of our history. There weren't these sort of arbitrary borders, even as early as 1900, 1910. There was no such thing as passports until after World War I, for the most part. So it was only with these conflicts that the notion that you have to ask for permission to travel the world, only then did it come into play. But again, the response would still be the same. You have to speculate on what you think a whole group of people are going to do. And that's kind of a wild speculation. Like, it's not necessarily founded. The United States is not the only place where people value freedom and human rights.
I think it's also important to say that the right wing, if you're going to correlate the right wing with libertarianism, which I don't know if you should or not, doesn't cater to immigrant populations. Like, even the rhetoric of more right-wing populations tends to be pretty anti-immigrant. So regardless of what their values may or may not be, there's almost like a tribalistic reason why a lot of people coming from other countries into the US would vote Democrat, because perhaps they don't feel respected by the people promoting these freedom-oriented values. I think that people are also making an assumption that even if we can look and say that the majority of immigrants right now are voting Democrat, or the majority of Hispanic immigrants are voting Democrat, people are making an assumption that that's because they don't like freedom and don't share values of free commerce and individuality and things like that. But that's not necessarily the case. Most people kind of just vote how their family votes, how their friends vote, and how they feel most comfortable voting culturally. And the right is really alienating people from other cultures by making the kinds of arguments that they are. So that might be a lot of the problem too.
There's a big irony in that too, because the Republicans are saying, oh, we hate socialism, we hate leftism. So in order to protect ourselves against socialism and leftism, we need to collectively own the entire half a continent and collectivize the ownership among the entire United States population, and then make decisions by a central bureaucratic authority over what happens with that collectively owned property and closing down the borders. Like, what could be more socialist or communistic than that notion?
Yeah. It's like, let's engage in a big government funding project to stop large government. I have heard people make both of those arguments about the voting and also about the cultural differences. I remember someone online was saying this stuff to me, like, these Mexicans come into California, they don't respect the law. And I was like, good. I mean, that's those are my kind of people. Like, a good person shouldn't follow laws too closely. If there's a whole bunch of laws, if you're in a country where there's more laws than you can count, yes, you should disregard them. And so it's really backwards, actually, because it's like, yes, these people actually are for liberty and they can recognize liberty, like, just intuitively. It's not like they have a philosophical understanding about it. They just know that they should be able to do what they want if it doesn't hurt people.
Yeah, but on the flip side, when I travel the world, I like to be aware of the local laws and customs, and I like to at least try to conform to those norms just to show respect for the people there. People do see that you're an outsider and you're representing, whatever group you're from when you visit that new place. If you get there and you just, totally disrespect all the norms, then people are going to judge you and the culture that you came from. And then I also wanted to add, so I kind of see where conservatives are coming from on this, because there's a phenomenon that you can especially see really well on the internet, where there is an existing culture. There's some online community, or this happens in real life too, but I'm going to use the internet as an example. There's an online community with a particular culture, and the people who have been there for a long time are very invested in this culture, and new people are kind of trickling in. And as the new people trickle in, the veterans are able to teach the new people the culture, and then the new people assimilate, and then they can teach it to other people. And there's a big problem which comes from when a community becomes suddenly popular and a whole bunch of people start joining that community. Then what you have is you have more new people than veterans. And when you have more new people than veterans, then the culture that existed before has to fight for survival. And a lot of times it just dies. A lot of times the new people don't get the original culture and they just kind of smother it because they don't get it.
An interesting example of this would be the anarcho-capitalist subreddit. I saw it completely taken over by the alt-right over the course of about a year.
Exactly. Subreddits are a perfect example of this, actually, where basically the moderators are just overwhelmed and they can't keep people on topic and they can't enforce the rules, and it just collapses. And the people who put their heart and soul into building the community and making it into what it is kind of just lose interest in it because they're like, well, I put all this work into it and now it's all destroyed. So I think concern in sort of conservative America that there's an essential Americanness that might get destroyed if too many people come in too fast.
What kind of countermeasures do you think, Chris, could be useful, both from sort of the general concepts, the infiltration concept, but then specifically maybe for America?
Well, as unpopular as this opinion might be, I think the process that we have, where we vet people, we do whatever background check we can on them when they come in, see if they have a criminal history. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think like checking to see whether somebody has committed crimes in their home country before coming to the US, I think that's a good policy.
I don't know. I think you have to be very careful with that. My buddy here, he needed to go to Canada for work. And I don't know if you've ever tried to get into Canada, but they can be pretty weird about things. So they told him, do you have a criminal record? He said, yeah, well, I have a DUI from when I was 21 or whatever.
Oh, and yeah, don't tell the Canadians that you have a DUI. Yeah, I've heard.
They said, okay, well, you need to go back to the courthouse in your hometown and get the record from 10 years ago from that DUI. And it's like, that's impossible. There's no way that's going to happen. So we couldn't go to Canada. So Canada. Yeah.
I think it's important to say, though, that that's absolutely not what the U.S. does in terms of vetting people. It's not just like some little criminal background check and then they let everybody in who doesn't have a criminal history. It's like long waiting lists, and you can get in if an employer is sponsoring you, but there's only a certain amount of those visas per year. You can get in if you have direct family members, but there's a wait list for that. You can get in if you're marrying someone from the U.S., but if you're not a highly in-demand worker who gets a particular company to sponsor you and go through a really long, expensive process for you, or if you don't have direct family members, you're probably not getting in. There's a lottery system that's really small, but it's not.
Yeah, I can talk for hours about immigration law in the United States, and that's actually the point that I wanted to make about legal immigrants coming to the United States and disrespecting the law. The process just makes it impossible to follow the law because, let's say, even in my situation, I got here, I got my green card as a person with extraordinary ability, which they kind of respect the most. And then I had to wait for my work authorization for like 2 years. So for 2 years, I did not have a right to work, to like get any kind of loan. I did not have a social security. I could not get my insurance. So it's just impossible to follow the law, even if you go in through legal immigration. That's why we all disrespect the law, all immigrants.
Yeah, and So I agree that the current process is probably a little too much. Like, it could definitely be made better. It could definitely be improved or made more efficient. The problem is, like, how do you keep track of like if somebody has no record, or if they do have like a DUI or something like that and they come into your country. I mean, so on the one hand, basically just restricting the flow. This is honestly like what online communities do. They just don't have a completely open policy, because if you do that, then what you're doing is incentivizing people to just come in, and then you'll get more and more flow of people.
That's not an incentive of itself, is it?
It could
I guess
be.
you could say it is if it's.
I think if the U.S. did that, it would definitely be.
But
yeah. Okay.
a person with a really small criminal record, let's say someone smoked weed in Russia, it's illegal there. If they got here, it's a criminal record. So, and they can't get into the US. But at the same time, the real criminal who has a real criminal record can go around any kind of law and still get here illegally. So he's going to be much more dangerous, but the person who smoked weed in Russia won't be able to get in. So people who really harm people still can get in, no matter what.
Good point.
Yeah. And I think a lot of these are kind of like when people complain about admissions processes at universities, they're like, oh man, like they didn't even really give, or like, job applications or something like that. They're like, oh, they just took one look at my resume and said no because it had this thing on it or something like that. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, but there's 10 times more people applying than can actually get the job. And so there has to be some kind of basic heuristic that allows you to do that allows you to kind of just be like, nope, and just kind of throw something away. So there's so much overhead for a government to keep track of all these people and make sure they're behaving while they're in the country.
That sort of evokes two important things. One, maybe the government shouldn't be keeping track of all those peoples and spending all that money. And the other one is that we have to be careful about the kind of analogies that we draw. The United States, the landmass of the United States, this is not a subreddit. This is not a college university. It's not a privately owned thing. In fact, vast swaths of land in the desert Southwest, nobody inhabits them, no one uses them. It's hard to say that anyone really has a legitimate claim of ownership. Maybe there's some partial claims that can happen there, but to have the full exclusive ownership with the threat of violence and taking that entire area and just cutting off the flow of people traveling, that's a whole different kind of analogy. So let's be careful about the analogies that we use.
Violence happens in the first place because some governments with their proof of violence protocol just make the life better for people. So
I like it.
if we don't have borders, don't have proof of violence, probably naturally we would spread equally. And I really believe there is supposed to be no immigration law whatsoever.
I think that would be the ideal world. That would change and shake things up a lot in the short term. We have to think about too, why do so many people want to come to the US as opposed to why do so few people want to go to Mexico or Honduras or to countries that people are usually flooding from to go into the US? And there's a lot of reasons, many of which are economic, many of which are violence, which a lot of times is funded by the US drug market and promoted by the US government in certain ways. And also just the way that the US promotes its currency as the reserve currency for the whole world. And I don't know, like living outside of the US, I'm realizing that it seems like jobs in the US are very overpaid compared to the amount that the average job is producing. Like you could be a waiter in Mexico on the other side of the border making $8 a day for more work than somebody just 30 miles away in the US making, 10 times as much. And if borders were open, there wouldn't be those huge incentives like that. So eventually there might not be such of a flood.
Right. And I do see the world kind of moving in that direction where there's basically arbitration pressures, especially in border areas where, as Katy was saying, you're going to earn 10 times more money for doing the same work 30 miles away. So obviously you're going to go do that if you can. And
obviously people within the area where you're earning 10 times as much money want to protect that bubble.
But over the long term, as the arbitration plays out, the same way that arbitration works on like Bitcoin exchanges, eventually, there isn't a difference between the two exchanges. Eventually on this side of the border or this side of the border, it evens out because kind of like diffusion, it just high concentration goes to low concentration and vice versa. So
yeah, except there's that artificial barrier there. And it's interesting, Katy, that you described it as a bubble because, that implies that one day it's just going to pop. Like the pressure. All the weight is just built up at the border and just all the restaurants.
I kind of see the US as like this gated community type bubble. And I think that it's unsustainable because especially with the internet, as people are able to see what it's like in other countries and with global commerce where people in certain rich countries are able to get extremely cheap labor from people in poorer countries, like I don't think that situation is going to hold. Why would I, if I can, why would I stay in that poorer country and make so little? And it's not about being a bad person or not respecting the law. The law isn't respecting you in that case. So it just doesn't make sense to stay as some kind of sacrificial lamb.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that the more and more people travel using airlines and the cheaper and cheaper that flights get, basically people are becoming more and more mobile. Information has been set free by the internet. I basically see maintaining borders as over time, it's going to become more and more expensive for governments to do. I think we're moving toward basically a globalized world where basically the differences on either side of any given border are basically neutral after a long time.
You know, it's interesting. We talk about this concept of borders, and I think someone mentioned earlier, I think it was Kurt, how exactly are the governments, you know, we don't want big government, so let's have a big government to defend the borders. And it's really ironic that a lot of militarized police equipment, a lot of massive surveillance apparatus has been created specifically to deal with this supposed border issue, which isn't even really like an issue. To me, it's a non-issue in comparison to all of the other crimes committed by the US government and all the crazy things that are happening around the world. This border issue is just minuscule, whether we're talking about the cost of building a wall or even the quote unquote problem of what's happening there at the border. The point being that there is a lot of focus on creating surveillance equipment and this militarized force to patrol the border. And that is pretty concerning because that's definitely a move that we see with fascist states or with autocratic authoritarian states is they close down their borders. They focus on keeping everything out or keeping all their people in.
Exactly. And they say that it's to keep people out, but then it eventually becomes a wall to keep people in.
Yeah, it's really funny to see that cognitive dissonance when I tell people, you know how it was in the two Germanys and they put up a wall and they're like, yeah, but our wall is to protect us. And I'm like, you think that in Germany they were telling them that the wall was to keep them in? Is that really what you think? And people can't wrap their heads around it.
Yeah. Propaganda is a very powerful force.
On the flip side, though, it is interesting to me now, though, that in kind of mainstream liberal America, you've got like normal statist liberal folks like protesting to allow undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants to stay. And when I question people about this, like, do you really believe that there shouldn't be borders, or do you really believe that they should just allow anybody to come in and stay? I don't think that's the point of view that most mainstream people actually support, but the propaganda from the left wing has made it so that to enforce immigration laws is seen as like this immoral and racist kind of thing. I'm for open borders, I think, but it's weird to see how that's playing out right now.
If you get rid of national borders, then you have, you know, state borders and city borders and gated communities. You still have smaller communities that can be selective about who they allow in. And I think you should have that. I mean, I think that you should be able to gather together with people that you like and that you work well with and be exclusive about who you let in, but maybe not, again, like on a national level. You know, if there's just little pockets of, and you see this in big cities, you know, you see like Chinatown and Koreatown and Little Italy and all these little enclaves of foreign countries inside American cities. I have no issue with that. I think people are worried that that's going to happen, that people are just going to come in and form little, like, you know, like a state, like you said, Anthony, like maybe in the desert in the Southwest, you know, just like a little, you know, little China or little Mexico, just like right there in the US.
Sounds cool.
I mean, it sounds cool to me. That's cool to me too, but I think people are very xenophobic. They're like, oh no, what's this other culture? Is it going to ruin everything? You know, is it going to be stronger than our culture? You know?
So one thing I'm seeing in the political discourse is that I think there's a little bit of an attempt to shift the Overton window where you have these leftists basically saying, I believe in border security. You know, all the politicians on the left, like, I believe in border security and we need to secure our borders and all this stuff, but we shouldn't build a wall, right? We should do other things. And what I see is both on the left and the right, this push towards a greater locking down of the borders. So this is how they do things in America and in a lot of places, is you encourage rampant debate, but you assume the party line from the beginning. The assumption is that we need to secure the borders, we need to stop the flow of illegals, it's dangerous and all yada, yada, yada. And then the rampant debate and the false dichotomy is build the wall or other surveillance measures, right? Other technological measures. And so this whole fiasco, this whole thing that's going on, I think is just an attempt to shift that conversation so that Americans are like, yeah, border security. I remember a time 20 years ago when people were like, yeah, you know, let's have the Mexicans come over, right? They pick our tomatoes and they do a lot of jobs that we don't want. There was a lot more sympathy. There was a lot more empathy, even just 20 years ago, that I don't see now. Where I see even people that are on the left are still like, no, border security, border security. It's just an argument now of how we're going to do it.
Well, and that's interesting to me because I don't see that so much on the left. Maybe we're talking about different people, but what I'm seeing coming from the left media is like a a lot of empathy for people who have come into the US illegally and are now being deported, and that being seen as a moral wrong, and to allow people to stay and to basically, I'm seeing a lot of people advocate almost for open borders, not directly, but they're saying that they shouldn't enforce immigration laws that are there.
Yeah, so I think you're right about that too. So I am seeing the concept of sort of amnesty from the left. I think there is a lot of talk about that, these sanctuary cities. There is the amnesty component, but at least from maybe the people I've seen like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and the people in the Capitol, they're trying to sound like kind of hawks on the border, like they're pro-amnesty, but then they also want to increase the border security. And obviously, there's reasons why authoritarians in the government on both sides would want to increase border security. It gives them more power, gives them more control, even as they provide for amnesty. And I think that's actually where there is a little bit of the argument that leftists want a lot of these immigrants to be able to vote, because it probably is true that a lot of them will tend to vote Democrat. I am also speculating on that statement.
I think a lot of them would tend to vote Democrat, but it's not necessarily because of their values. Living in Latin America for a while, at least in Mexico, people seem a lot of times more conservative than in the US.
People are super conservative in Mexico.
It's very Catholic. It's more traditional on average, I would say. So,
yeah, family values.
They do tend to vote Democrat, but I don't think that's necessarily because of values. Maybe it's more so because the right-wing parties are demonizing them.
Yeah,
that actually might be true. Yeah, they're just like, wow, these Republicans really hate us. I guess we should vote Democrat.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting how their values might actually be more closely aligned with conservatism, but then they're tricked into voting Democrat. At least historically, that's been the case. Maybe new immigrants would not vote Democrat. I mean, as an anarchist, I would hope that immigrants just wouldn't vote at all.
That'd be great.
What I've seen as well online, I've seen some memes, and as far as I can tell, they come from the left, and they say stuff like, don't talk to ICE. These people are our friends and neighbors and everything. We don't have any interest in enforcing these weird laws on them and stuff like that.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that too.
And it makes me think of, I can't remember the name of the event, but it was this certain event that was key to the abolition of slavery in the US. So it was some kind of siege, like all of these people coming in to lynch these slaves and drag them back to their masters. And they were like at a hotel. What was it?
I think it was called Harper's Ferry. I could be wrong about that.
Harper's Ferry. Okay.
Like
anyway, people coming in with pitchforks and everything, and people there in the hotel.
Like John Brown, right?
John Brown? I don't remember that.
Yeah, he was like a really big abolitionist, and whenever abolition was happening.
Fair enough. Maybe he was involved. But basically, as far as I could tell, it's like a community movement. Like these people had just had enough. They're like, no, these aren't slaves. These are human beings, and we're not going to tolerate this. So the people who wanted to drag them back, they just had to give up. And I wonder, when do people get to that point? Like nobody really wants to volunteer, but at some stage you have to be like, no.
Yeah. So you're kind of asking the question, when do people like actually physically resist versus just disobey?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question.
And when they do, I think it'll be a turning point. Sorry?
I think that happens when it's likely to work. If critical mass hasn't been reached and it's just you going, I'm going to physically resist, then you're probably not going to make much difference. But if you have 100 people with you, then maybe you will.
I think there's a lot of chaos or some tumultuous times coming in the next 2 years. I think we're seeing the beginning of it in France, in Europe with, the Yellow Vest movement. I think America is kind of being set up in a way mentally for that sort of thing to happen. Honestly, I'm taking off. I'm getting out of the country, and I don't really plan on coming back, because what I see happening in the next 2 years is sort of the fall of the United States dollar, the fall of the economy. There's this big complex about security and borders and all these things. And it just seems like, and I hope I'm wrong about it. Like I could very easily be wrong, and maybe I'm just creating this bogeyman. But every time I come back to America, I'm very struck by how many police I see and the mentality of people around me. As soon as I get in the airport, I see TSA or cops, and it's like they've just got this really sour look on their faces, and they're like directing people, you go here and there and do this. And, other countries that I've been to, everyone's just like pretty chill. Of course, it's not perfect. There's problems everywhere. My plan is to actually leave the country for a couple years and just sort of wait it out and see what happens, because it seems like there's this tension is just continuing to grow. And not only is it growing, it's being purposefully fostered by both ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah, and I think there's an undercurrent that we're seeing, sort of history is unfolding. And what I think you're seeing is I think you're seeing the internet and other forms of technology basically eroding the power of the nation state. And I think that cryptocurrency is going to be huge in that process because right now the nation state can fund border security. But I think you're seeing it kind of reach a point where it's really not able to do that anymore. There isn't the will to fund border security. And I think as nation states worldwide become defunded by, people moving to cryptocurrencies, and so they can't tax through inflation, they can't tax through income taxes. So as they lose their sources of revenue, they're going to become smaller and smaller and probably more efficient. I see this as an inevitable, but basically positive process.
I see that as a long-term.
Yeah, I see that ways down the line. I don't think that cryptocurrency is having a huge impact on the U.S. government's ability to collect taxes at this point.
Yeah,
nor do I think it will in even the next 5 years, probably.
Yeah.
Okay,
10,
but eventually.
20, 30, 40,
10 years? I'd say 10 years. So
I think if you give it another
I'd
10
say
years,
eventually.
it might be starting. I think maybe within 10 years, we'll see some third world countries adopting cryptocurrency more and more after their currencies have collapsed. Maybe the U.S.'s currency is going to collapse. I think that once crypto gets to a big point of usability and smartphone penetration is high enough and a currency collapses all in the same place at the same time, that's when you're going to see it. And then once it becomes mainstream in one area, then I think it'll spread. So maybe that's 10 years.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is I really do think the concept of borders is going to go away. Maybe not in the next year or two, but probably eventually.
Eventually, yeah. In the next year or two,
And,
though,
national borders. I think there will still be gated communities and, small communities of sort of exclusive people. Basically,
Katy, in the next couple of years, do you expect?
I think you're right. I think that the U.S. is polarizing both left and right. Even if the actual policies that people are advocating aren't that different from each other, the animosity between different groups of people in the U.S. is growing, and there seems to be a ton of anxiety about borders. In rural areas, I think people have a ton of anxiety about jobs and their way of life, and it just doesn't seem like the energy in the U.S. is calm or calming down. It seems to be getting progressively worse, and I think we'll probably see more extreme antagonistic rhetoric and probably more instability in the next few years.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah.
It was an interesting phenomenon to watch. It seemed like there was a liberty movement that happened that started with Ron Paul, and it seemed like a lot of people in the country that were very interested in human rights and having better policies and smaller government and less warfare. But then the Trump phenomenon, it seems like the majority of those people kind of got recaptured in a way and put right back into the false dichotomy. Honestly, that's probably the most concerning development that I see so far, is because the people that would have had the gumption to sort of keep the government in check, now that their king is in power, they're totally willing to give all of that liberty away and say, nope, let's support Trump. And not only that, but it's happening simultaneously. It's happening simultaneously with the rejection of the dollar. It's not really a light switch. It's sort of a process that's been happening for quite some time. Again, the stock markets are looking pretty bad. We're hitting a bond curve yield inversion, which is, I think we talked a little bit about this before, where the shorter term bonds yield higher than the longer term bonds. We're right on the edge of that. And that's the canary in the coal mine, that we've got another economic recession. But the difference is now that, the world isn't completely reliant on the dollar. Russia and China and all these other countries have been setting up economic trade zones that completely bypass the dollar. And of course, cryptocurrencies plays a role in that. And so what I see is sort of the end of that paradigm and a transition that has to take place. And I just wonder, what kind of transition will that be, especially for America, when it's full of people that are so authoritarian in their mindset. They have the idea, I just want to give away my power. We want to put the right guy in office and he or she will do everything perfect for us. And it's just like, man, I just see this very socialistic, communistic mindset on both sides, even the Republicans.
So what I think is going to be a key component to the process of what we're talking about with globalization and polarization. I think you're going to start seeing nation states forking. You're going to start seeing lots of secession movements where, the rightists over here are like, let's all move to Texas and break off from the U.S., and all the lefties can go to California and they can all break off from the U.S. And I think you're going to see that. The internet is bringing people closer and closer and closer together. And so they're becoming more and more sensitive to differences in their values. So I think people are going to sort into the different states in the U.S. based on their values. And I think that's a good thing.
I guess it could be both a good thing and a bad thing, because that sounds a lot like tribalism, right? That sounds like growing tribalism. And there are beneficial aspects of tribalism, but there's also negative aspects. So I would be concerned what the nature of that.
I mean, actual mobility in the U.S. is at the lowest point since the 1950s or or 60s. People aren't moving very much in the US right now. I think we're thinking about people who are really politically engaged and super deep into online communities, but that's not the majority of people at all. The majority of people are dealing with like stagnating wages and not a lot of opportunity and don't have the means or the motivation to move right now.
At least not right now, but I see mobility becoming cheaper and cheaper as time goes on. And I think maybe in the next generation or two, you're likely to see more sort of self-sorting of people.
Which part of the US do you think will secede first?
I don't think the US would let anyone secede.
I mean, so the thing is, central governments are going to lose power as cryptocurrencies defund them. So, it might not be soon. Again, it might be in a generation, it might be in 2 generations, but eventually people are just going to start seceding and there's not going to be much that the centralized nation states can do.
Right. Well, yeah.
That's what happened to Soviet Russia.
Yeah.
And the short term, we're seeing more nationalism, and maybe different countries are going to start doing things like pulling out of trade agreements and, Brexit. Maybe there will be other countries exiting the European Union. And I think that the whole globalization process is having its reaction moment right now. Well, I don't think you're going to see I don't think you're going to see Florida becoming a country, but
and I do think that we'll continue to see those kind of meta supranational organizations like the EU or some of these trade organizations where it's still individual sovereign countries, but they're coming together to form this kind of union thing. I think you'll see that still. It's just
I think it's something interesting that we're kind of existing on 2 sides of possibility right now. On the one side, because of the conflict, I think there's the real possibility that we end up in a very more free state, including the United States. On the other hand, I also see this very the other side of that is this stark reality that perhaps America ends up more locked down, more authoritarian, more national socialist. And I can't really see for America how that's going to unfold, because being here, I see a lot of ignorance, but I do see potential as well. And I just feel like there's probably safer places in the world to go live or to go be right now. It's kind of like we have the potential for both, and I really can't see which direction that goes.
I think anywhere is safe as long as you're working online. I don't know if trying to pick a spot right now is the best idea, but trying to create a life where you are mobile and are borderless as an individual person is probably a good strategy.
The way I see it, I prefer living kind of in a poorer country because there's going to be a lot of turmoil. And I feel like the US, if it collapses, is going to have much further to fall than a country that's kind of already poor. And actually, I think the emerging countries have a lot to gain from the US declining. And so I think it's likely that over the next several decades, what you're going to see is you're going to see a decline in the US and a lot of turmoil as people experience a lot of pain from that decline. And you're going to see wealth kind of flow to emerging countries, and those people are going to be really happy and having a great time.
What's the mechanism, though? How does the wealth flow? Is it because trade somehow opens up, or what happens to make the wealth flow?
Yeah, it's just because it's cheaper to live in third world countries, and so so basically you're going to have this arbitrage process where maybe you've read The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, where he talks about geographical arbitration and earning your money in one currency and buying things using a different currency and I think you're going to see more and more and more of that, and eventually that's going to have an equalizing effect among the nations of the world until basically the living standard between all the countries is pretty much the same.
As long as they're not so bad that people don't want to go to like North Korea or something, not so great for tourists. All right, so with the secession thing, I wanted to talk a little about Catalonia. It's a weird situation. What happened was they went to a referendum and people voted, but it was very narrow margin. It was a yes to secede from Spain. And so maybe it was like 51, 50, 52%, something like that. And not everybody in Catalonia voted. So it just got by, and they're like, all right, let's do this. So that's, maybe that's a bit questionable in some ways. I mean, there are people from all over Spain who live in Catalonia, so they don't necessarily identify as Catalan. Then what happened was that they're like, yeah, let's do this, or the politicians said that. The Spanish government is like, no, you're not doing that. And they came in and arrested half of the Catalan government, and the other half of the politicians, they're off running all through Europe, I suppose. So a very weird situation. And, I meet some Catalonians who are like, oh, yes, definitely secede, like, get away from it. It seems like Catalonia gets the bum deal. Like, they get taxed, they produce a lot of stuff, and they get taxed more than the rest of Spain. That's how it seems.
Is that where Barcelona is? Like, I forget.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, historically, it's a bit complicated. I think Spain was formed out of 5 or 7 kingdoms, and so they still have, each region still has its own culture and stuff, and so it's kind of interesting, like meeting people from, I think from Galicia. They heard me speak Spanish and they're like, hang on, just you kind of sound Galician, because all of Latin America, basically the Spanish came from Galicia.
Oh, I didn't know.
Catalonia has a history of secession and revolution, don't they?
Yeah, because there was the Spanish Civil War, right? I don't know too much about that, but yeah, that was related.
Back before World War II, just before World War II, there was the Catalonians kind of overthrew all the bourgeoisie, if you will, and they started for a very short period of time what you could call an anarcho-syndicalist community, where it's kind of like anarcho-communism in a way, without the centralized bureaucracy, and it was actually functioning pretty okay. When they overthrew all of the rich people, they said, all right, look, everybody just keep going back. If you work in a factory on Monday, we're all going to show back up to the same jobs that we were doing. Only now the restaurants where the rich people all eat, they're going to be open for everyone to eat. So they had this kind of movement that was actually fairly successful. They teamed up with the communists. So there were sort of 3 factions. There was the fascists, and that was with Franco. There was the communists, and then there was, I don't think they called themselves anarcho-syndicalists, but if you look at the interviews, they called themselves anarchists. So it was a flavor of anarchy. So they teamed up with the communists. Ultimately, that was kind of their undoing. And then ultimately, Franco just took them all over and just crushed that movement. And then we ended up in World War II, and Spain was mostly aligned with Germany at that point. So the fascists kind of won out in that case. But it's interesting because it's one of the few cases of actual anarchy of any flavor in the world to have been tried.
Cool. I hear that Ireland was also anarcho-capitalist for a while until the British came over and took that over.
Yeah, there was the Brehon system of law that existed for 9,000 years by some counts.
Yeah.
Which is, some people class that as, well, it's not exactly anarcho-capitalist. It's like, but like decentralized governance. So pretty much.
I was recently doing some research on sailing and the Coast Guard and the possibility of having a boat, and sort of traveling around. And I found out that the Coast Guard, at least in the United States, they don't need any reason. They don't need any suspicion of a crime. They don't need a warrant. They don't need any reason whatsoever to board your vessel and to search it completely and verify that you have your papers in order, whether your boat certifications and your license and all your safety stuff. And it's all allegedly for your protection and for drug interdiction, things like that. But when you're driving on the roads, the police at least are supposed to have some kind of probable cause to stop you. But when you're out on the high seas, at least anywhere near an American territory, they can stop you for any reason whatsoever. And I was like, wow, I was really surprised. And you actually, if you do a lot of boating, offshore, they say you can expect to get boarded probably once every 1 to 2 years. You'll get boarded by the Coast Guard. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because you would think, wow, why is it that on the roads, you might say, hey, someone had to build the roads, whatever, but you didn't build the ocean. So why do you just get to come and board my vessel without any probable cause? But apparently that's been the case since the inception of the United States.
Yeah, apparently the Constitution doesn't imply, in the water, just only on the land.
And that kind of goes back to some of the things that Kurt was talking about earlier, the City of London. These governments are really corporate entities. They're corporations in a lot of ways. I think that's what they're claiming to be, whether or not they say it in so many words. But they're acting.
Well, the City of London is explicit. It is a corporation, and they're very open about that.
Yeah, so Kurt, so you were talking about that earlier, but we didn't record it. So can you just go ahead and say what you said then?
Yeah, so the City of London is a unique place or unique organization. So the City of London is actually separate from Greater London. Greater London is comprised of 33 areas. Most of them are counties, and one of them is the City of London. And it's not controlled by Parliament. So the British Parliament has no power within the City of London. It's controlled by the Lord Mayor. And I have this interesting extract from an article in The Guardian. To become Lord Mayor, you must have first served as an alderman and sheriff, and you must command the support of and have the endorsement of the Court of Aldermen and the Livery. You should also be stinking rich, as the Lord Mayor is expected to make a contribution from his or her private resources towards the costs of the mayoral year. This is, in other words, an official old boys network. So, so it's this weird aristocracy, and this article describes it as a medieval institution. So very unusual.
And so that's the City of London, you said?
Is all of London
Yes.
part of the City of London, or is that just a
No.
part of London?
It's just a part of London. So as I said, Greater London is 32 boroughs plus the City of London. So it's just this area. People in London sometimes call it the square mile, because that's when the Romans came and set up Londinium in what is now London. They fenced it off and it was 1 square mile. Now the area is actually 2 square miles, but they still call it that.
Well, it sounds like a lovely gated community with strong borders.
A bank, a
It
very
sounds
well
like an
banked.
economic development zone or something.
Right, like a SEZ or something.
Yeah.
But where it's
Autonomous
actually,
region.
Yeah, it's autonomous. It's interesting because some governments will recognize that it is useful for them to have a small area outside of them or within them or really close where the rules don't apply, so that they can just have all this economic growth, and then being very close to the rest of the country is good.
Yes.
Actually,
Well,
where I grew up, Bloomington, Minnesota, it's not like autonomous and free from the state government or anything like that. But there's a huge section of the city where I grew up, which is run by a corporation, and that's where the Mall of America is and several other economic type.
So it's basically just like a privately owned neighborhood.
Kind of. I don't know. It's a weird quasi-public-private thing. The mayor doesn't have any control over the area. The rest of the city rules and taxes don't apply really. However, it's not like all the land is owned by a corporation. There's people that live there and they own their houses as they would in other areas. It's an interesting legal entity.
So I read an article by Jeffrey Tucker about a place called Atlantic Station in Atlanta, which sounds kind of similar to what you were talking about, where there's basically, this one corporation that owns the entire neighborhood, and they hire their own private police to the Atlantic Station police or whatever. And they're just on the payroll of this corporation. And, Jeffrey Tucker, of course, goes there and goes, "Oh my God, it's so nice." And the policemen are just helpful. They're not trying to pat me down and search me. They're just trying to direct me to the nearest, whatever it is I need. Yeah, it sounded very sort of utopian, but yeah.
McDonald's sounds utopian from Tucker.
Maybe it would sound utopian from Jeffrey Tucker.
But I did go there and it was very nice.
I mean, Bloomington, that area of Bloomington's got a roller coaster park inside a mall. It's a capitalist dream.
Wow.
Capitalism.
It has been my experience, though, that if you're not in your home country, you tend to be treated better, at least in places that are, not like oppressive North Korea. And there is this concept of sort of spreading your political risk where you use different countries for different things. Like you might have a business, an LLC, based in one country. And I think the ANCAPs have actually talked about this quite a lot. I might be going over things that are already well known, but, the idea is that...
like 5 flags or 7 flags, they call it, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. You've got your LLC in one country, you do your banking in another country, you might live somewhere outside of your country, and then you might have sort of a playground, Mexico maybe.
Residence in another, citizenship in another.
Yeah, I really personally want to get another citizenship or passport.
Yeah, having 2 passports would be awesome. That is actually one of my goals.
That would be a good idea. I think it's important to say, though, that people get treated better when they're outside their country if they're coming from a rich Western country and going to a poorer country where people think you have money and can benefit.
Right. If you're a tourist who's going to spend a bunch of money, then people are going to treat you well.
Yeah, but I don't think that's necessarily the case for all or most foreigners spending time in different countries. They
definitely didn't treat me so nice the last time I came in here to Britain. They detained me for 2.5 hours.
Wow. What did they ask you about?
They basically wanted to know that I wasn't just coming here to work, which I don't know what kind of schedule they would think I'd be on, where I come for 1 month and go to the continent for 2 weeks and then come back. What kind of job would I possibly be working there?
Could be online.
Yeah, well, exactly. They think their country is so special that I want to stay here. And especially
not that UK.
Yeah, I won't be back for a while.
I'm curious, Anthony, you're saying that you're interested in getting out of the U.S. because you see it destabilizing. Where do you think would be a good place to ride it out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would like to go to a place where, at a bare minimum, people don't look at the government, at police, in such a reverent manner. It's a very common trait in the United States, whether you're on the left or right. People look at the police and oh, we got to obey the police and obey the government, and they're great and our heroes. And at least in places like Mexico and other countries, most other countries, in fact, especially especially ones that have gone through some kind of economic trouble. At the very least, the people sort of don't respect the police and they disobey. You kind of have to do things a whole different way. And I think you guys, having lived in different places, know that. My biggest concern is that something bad happens, and instead of Americans taking the one mindset and saying, you know what, this government stuff was ridiculous, let's figure out how to take care of ourselves, they say, oh shit, we really need the government, we need national emergency, what do they call it?
Emergency powers.
Yeah, emergency, all that kind of stuff. I totally see that as a possibility. So to answer your question, in a short way to answer it, I'm going to go check out Puerto Rico. I like that half of that island has been trying to vote to secede for a long time. I was there last year back in March, and it seemed like a lot of crypto people are moving there. It seems like even politically, you're afforded a level of risk mitigation just because of taxes, things like that. Plus, just geographically, you're next to a whole bunch of different places, right? You're close to Cuba, you're close to Dominica, even Venezuela. Not that I want to go to Venezuela, but you're close to South America. I at least want to go check that place out. I think it would be a decent place to maybe, I don't want to say ride it out, because I don't necessarily think it's like, chaos and mayhem and everything. I just don't want to be around for the next couple years, because maybe.
I definitely had some of that as well, where I was like, yeah, maybe the U.S. isn't the best place to spend the next few years.
And for the record, I know that Puerto Rico is technically part of the U.S., so
yeah,
like an idiot.
Yeah. Probably not according to them, right?
At least not half of them.
So they're trying to become a state, and they're trying to secede?
A lot of people are trying to secede, and a lot of people are trying to become a state, but I don't think too many people like the situation they're in now.
Plus, it's close to St. Kitts, and I've heard that you can get a passport in St. Kitts pretty quickly.
How much is it?
$178,000.
Like you buy $178,000 of land there?
No, you just pay them.
No, it's not an investment. You just give it to them.
Yeah, so we definitely need another Bitcoin bull market. that can't come soon enough.
The thing that I don't get about a lot of these people, the crypto people moving to or getting a citizenship or passport from St. Kitts or Puerto Rico, or just one of these tiny islands that are definitely in the sphere of influence of the U.S. military. They're moving there like it's this free libertarian utopia type thing. Once it becomes that, and it really, really starts to give the U.S. problems, don't you think they're going to come in and just shut it down?
That's if it becomes a big thing. And it's also just the passport. For a lot of them, that's just what they want. They don't want to live there.
I don't think most of them are actually moving there. They're just doing it to have a second passport and maybe the possibility of renouncing U.S. citizenship so that they don't have to pay so many U.S. taxes if they're going to live elsewhere. Also, I'm really not concerned about that becoming a mainstream. Even if there is an arbitrage opportunity, just the vast majority of people are not that interested in spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a second passport.
Right. But that's not, the U.S. doesn't care about the average person. The U.S. cares about those tax revenues from the rich people. That's who they care about. So if there's a big tax haven in St. Kitts, I think if the U.S. went into St. Kitts and was like, okay, you're now U.S. territory, I'm not really sure that anybody could do anything about that.
I don't think that kind of stuff is as socially acceptable for states to do anymore. I think the other states...
What are they going to do, though? I mean...
I don't know exactly.
Is it going to be a war, like the St. Kitts versus the U.S.?
There's not necessarily going to be a war, but states do have to kind of maintain some sense of respectability on the international sphere. If a state just stops respecting other states' sovereignty, if it's a state that the other states that have some power then it can be bad for their reputation and bad for their...
They won't get invited to dinner parties.
It can, but I guarantee you the U.S. would have a great narrative to go along with why we could go after those tax cheats in St. Kitts. Those are bad people, and we need to go after them.
So we're going to take over the entire nation.
Yeah, we'd be like, they'd come up with some narrative, they're all terrorists. Let's get them. That's what they did in Iraq. That's what they did in Afghanistan. That's what they did in Syria. Why would they not do it in St. Kitts?
Yeah, there are a lot of rich people that want to use St. Kitts and other islands as a tax haven, Nevis and, Barbados, wherever. They need to keep some avenues open for themselves to create these tax loopholes. I don't know. Maybe they close down St. Kitts and they secretly open some other island jurisdiction unbeknownst to the plebes like myself. But just having the second passport can be a useful thing, not because of wanting to live in St. Kitts or get into the United States with my St. Kitts passport, but just to go to other places in the world that are like, hey, you've got a second passport. For example, getting into Brazil, you've got to apply for a visa. But if you have a Russian passport, you just have easy entry into Brazil, no problem. Ideally, maybe I would probably try and get a passport from a different country than St. Kitts. But, that was just an example. Maybe if I could get a Brazilian passport, right? Somewhere on the other side of the polarization, of the world, because, you kind of spread your political risk among both the East and the West.
Having a foreign passport helps you on extreme ends. When you're really in trouble, all you can do is hey, just I want to talk to my guys and they deport me to my country. That's when you're like really in trouble. Or on another hand, when I getting pulled over by the police, I'm like, hey, here's my Russian driver license. Or my dad went to Russia and showed them his American driver license. He doesn't even speak English. He knows like 5 words. Like, hello, American citizen. And they're like, oh.
Katy and her family lives the anarchy way more than I do, at least personally, way more than a lot of people. But, and maybe you can talk more on this yourself, Yekaterina. But from what I understand, a lot of people in Russia sort of naturally have this anarchistic mindset where it's like, yeah, the government's corrupt. No, we don't trust police. Of course they're liars. Of course I'm just going to pay someone off and disregard the law if I'm able to do it.
Yeah, there's no as much respect as you guys have here in the United States. Like, as I mentioned, the police is just like the lowest levels of society, and we're like, oh yeah, he couldn't get into school, he couldn't get a job, so he went to work there. So we just don't respect them, and it definitely helps in not obeying the law.
I mean, is there something to be said though for respect for the rule of law? Maybe that's the reason why America is doing pretty well relative to the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, I think it goes like this. I think it works on a really long timeline. So the thing is, maybe 100 years ago, the US police were really respectable and not so corruptible. And that's part of the reason that people have so much respect for them today. Whereas in other countries, they've always been kind of shit. But now people still show that respect for them, even though times have actually changed. Maybe. And I think it's also kind of a cycle. So, as you pointed out, I guess maybe if the US police started out more respectable and then people respected them because of that, then people were more confident about doing business or something like that in the US because they kind of had faith that the police weren't going to just arbitrarily come after them and they'd have to have a good reason. Whereas in a country where the police are corrupt, basically you just have to piss somebody off and they basically shut you down or they, kidnap your family or something. People don't trust the system as much. And so they don't feel confident enough to start businesses. And when people don't feel confident enough to start businesses, then of course people don't start businesses and the number of jobs, declines. And then people start looking to move, to go somewhere else where there are opportunities.
By the way, about government shutdown, since it was shut down for 23 days now, and they don't provide their services, are those 23 days are going to be excluded from the tax receipts?
Of course not.
Yeah, of course not. Like, you don't provide your services, like, please excluded from my...
That's an interesting idea, though. Although they have kept, most of the government open. They've only furloughed, non-essential employees. So they've stopped doing certain things, but
National Park.
Yeah. But
I think WIC has stopped. That's an issue for a lot of people.
WIC?
I think the IRS office has shut down as well temporarily.
Oh, good for us.
Wow. I heard that they were still issuing refunds.
No, they're still collecting taxes, but I don't think they're issuing refunds. That's what I've heard.
Oh, okay.
Collecting taxes.
Yeah, you can still send them a bank wire, and they're totally cool with it. They're totally cool with that.
The receiving department is still open.
Essential, which is giving money back.
Yeah, they're not going to give you a refund, of a few percent and go, well, the government was closed for a few percent of the year, so here's your money back.
Yeah,
I wish.
I think Chris might have been getting at something interesting, though, with respect for the rule of law, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, most of us are anarchists or anarcho-leaning or whatever, want smaller government and want people to not rely on government for everything and want us to have more voluntary institutions that are self-sufficient. However, is distrust of the government necessarily a good correlation for whether or not that society is more free, or does it just mean that their government is so messed up that there's a lot of chaos and distrust and violence and stuff like that in the country? That's not necessarily the best environment for there to be a free society and a self-sufficient society. Just because people don't trust the government doesn't necessarily mean it's a freer or more freedom-oriented place. A place where people respect the rules generally might be more ripe for people to eventually realize that they don't need this violent structure to hold the general rules of engagement in place.
Right. So what I was trying to get at is that a free society isn't just chaos normally a free society has norms, has things that are considered moral and things that are considered immoral. And generally in a decentralized society, actually I like to use Burning Man as a sort of example of this because it's where I kind of really saw anarchism in action. And what happens there is there's these 10 principles and you have to leave no trace. That's one of the principles. And there isn't, the leave no trace police that if they see you drop something on the ground, say go, oh, you're arrested or we're going to fine you or you should pick that up. It's just everybody is kind of imbued with these principles and everybody collectively enforces them. And so the laws or not the laws, but the rules are very highly respected because everybody sees their benefit and everybody follows them and everybody enforces them. So I really do think that in a free society, you want order like that. You want some kind of order. It doesn't need to be centrally enforced, but it needs to be agreed to by the participants in the society. All right, I guess you guys all agree with that. I guess I made a really great point.
Yeah, well, if we could have a society where we actually had the option to enter or not enter, and as we enter, they say, hey, so these are the rules we go by here. Do you want to come in and get along with us? I guess that's kind of what the idea is when you go through immigration, but it's not quite like that.
Yeah, exactly. Like participating in the society has kind of like a waiver that you sign at the beginning that, maybe the one that you're born in doesn't count because you really didn't agree to it. But if you're going to move to some other society, you should study the customs, the laws, and you should follow them. I think that's, if you just go there and you just don't even read the laws and you just start doing whatever the hell you want, then you're corrosive to that society.
But if we're talking about mass scale societies, though, having too many rules is corrosive to the society itself.
Definitely. I mean, you want to have good rules that people can respect.
Yes, and not too many.
Right. Enough, so that everybody can remember them, or not too much, so that everybody can remember them.
Yeah.
Well, and I think libertarians and anarchists generally agree on the rules.
Kind of.
Yeah, more or less. One interesting example, I had a student who is from Taiwan, and she told me that people do not respect the police there. Like, police are basically pussies because that's kind of how the society has forced them to be. So if the police do something bad, people will be on them so quickly. And that means that it probably has gone too far, at least according to my student, my friend. She said that, say there's a fight and something's going on, the police will come up, but they're not going to interfere in the fight because then maybe the police will get charged with assault or something like that. So they can't actually, it interferes with their ability to protect people.
Interesting. And would you say that's a net negative for Taiwan? Or would she say that that's...
Well, from her opinion, yes, it was, but I have to see it myself. But when she told me, I was like, that sounds good. I want those.
Yeah, also, this is anecdotal, but I've heard that Taiwan is one of the safest places in the world.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah, they say it's like Japan, but cheaper.
So maybe that's because the police are very hands-off.
Yeah, maybe that has something to do with it. Or maybe people are very intolerant of violence in general. That has something to do with it as well. Several factors there.
Yeah. I don't think we can just say that it's a causal factor, but if you have a society that's pretty intolerant of violence, then they would also be intolerant of authoritarian police, and not having such authoritarian police would probably make the people less on edge too. And you can either have virtuous cycles or vicious cycles, but I don't think that we can just point to cause and effect with those kinds of things.
Yeah. Whenever you want to study the functioning of a society, you kind of have to do so from a historical viewpoint. You have to look at it over time and see what things were implemented and try to establish a cause and effect. But a lot of times phenomena that you observe are both the cause and the effect.
Yeah.
What do you think about Australia, Kurt, in terms of freedom and just general anarchy principles?
Okay. Well, people ask me about Australia. I guess I'm harsh on the place I grew up in, but one great thing about Australia is it is very safe. It is extremely safe. Ridiculously safe. Like I say to people, you could probably withdraw $200 from an ATM in Melbourne and walk around with it in your hands and you wouldn't get robbed. I don't recommend doing that, but I think you could. It is really safe. So, that's one of the things that you want in a free society. It's one measure of freedom, how much people are attacking each other and that sort of thing. But people do have this mentality. Some people say it descends from being convicts. So people have this mentality like, yeah, we're going to complain a lot about what the government is doing, but we're not really going to do anything about it. So it's like they're prisoners. Yeah, those wardens, terrible guys. But what are you going to do? there is a kind of anti-authoritarianism there, but people are also very, I don't know, it's a weird thing because, yeah, there's anti-authoritarians, but everybody kind of supports the government as well. They're very, very strong believers in government. One thing would be if you wanted to start some kind of community or like an intentional community, there's a lot of land and probably a lot of it is too far away from police or other authorities that they'd be bothered to come and even look at what you're doing. So that's one thing.
Yeah, that seems like there's little pockets of freedom in a lot of different places. Like in Texas, for example, there's a lot of unincorporated land. And because it's unincorporated, you basically have no taxes or almost no taxes. And you can pretty much build what you want. You can sort of experiment. The only thing is a lot of that land is way out in the desert, pretty far away from civilization.
I used to run like kind of an open mic for speakers for a couple months, and it was mostly anarchists. And I forget who it was, but one guy came up and said something that I really liked, which was that the state exists in a little bubble around the cop car. Like what you're doing in your day-to-day life, you're free. You don't have to live as if you're constantly under surveillance and constantly under oppression, because for the most part, you're not. Maybe they could check in on you if they wanted to, but for the most part, people are living their lives independently and they're more mentally changed to it. Like if you get further away geographically from cities and areas where state infrastructure is really strong and present, then yeah, you could say that's freer in a way. But I think that it would be more of a limit on my freedom to withdraw from society and people and all of the things that I like doing in order to avoid the state than it would be to deal with the state sometimes.
Yeah.
When people say that they're more free by living off grid and living really far away from cities, if that's what you would want to do, even if there is no state, if you're really introverted and like the idea of living out kind of in the middle of nowhere with no one else around, then great, and you are more free. But if you're completely reorganizing your life in order to avoid the state, then I would say that's less free in a big way.
Yeah. I tend to think one of the best things that people can do to improve their freedom in mass is you don't necessarily have to resist, but just disobey. Like stop paying taxes, right? Stop obeying the laws. Stop, all the little nitpick BS things that are required of you. Just be like, no thanks. And if people did that in mass, like there's no way that the IRS, for example, could come after, even if 5%, right? If just 1 out of 20 Americans were to just stop paying taxes, particularly people that own businesses, right? It's harder to do that if you're employed by a big corporation. But if you own your own business, just be like, no, I'm not going to pay those taxes anymore. We would actually come a long way towards freedom without having to do any kind of active resistance other than that.
One thing I did notice when I went back to Australia the last time, I noticed more open black market activity. So the tax on cigarettes gets ridiculously high. It costs like 25 Aussies to buy a pack of cigarettes or something.
Whoa.
So
the Aussie dollar is like almost the US dollar.
No, that's like 18, 19 US dollars.
Yeah, that's a lot for a pack of cigarettes.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure it's like $5 like in New York. And that's expensive.
Yeah. So the government keeps taxing it. So you get things like you go to a corner store in the suburbs and there's a Lebanese guy running it and you're like, hey, you got some of those Chinese cigarettes? And he sells you these pack of Double Happiness for $12. And you're like, sweet. It's like half the cost of regular cigarettes. And a lot of small businesses do cash business. Like a friend of mine works in a bookstore and she says, officially, all of the employees are only on for 5 hours a week, I think. And the rest of the time, they just get paid in cash. So it does seem like there's more of this stuff, at least for me, it seems like there's more of this stuff going on now than there was 10 years ago. So it's like the government keeps trying to clamp down and people are like, I've had enough.
So I do think that the existence of a black market is indicative of a society where there's a discrepancy between the morality of the people and the laws of the land. As you were saying, Anthony, people en masse are basically saying, we don't respect these laws because basically they're harmful to us. And so they build black markets and they do transactions without giving the government a cut. I really do think that you're going to see income taxes, especially once people start using the Lightning Network or things like it, where basically payments are just totally anonymous. Individual income taxes are going to be really, really hard to enforce. I still think that governments will be totally able to tax businesses that have a physical presence within what they see as their jurisdiction.
Yeah, Yeah, that's the thing with physical permanence. It definitely gives a bigger and easier target for authorities to go after, which is probably, why a lot of us like to live the permanent traveler lifestyle. You're not a resident anywhere. It's pretty hard to try and apply certain laws, certain statutes and codes to you.
Which is why I think that basically running an online business is going to be seen as untaxable. Maybe not soon, but eventually, once enough people are using these more or less anonymous payment methods. Like if you have a business that doesn't have a physical presence, there's nobody that's going to be able to enforce taxes on you. But most businesses will require some kind of physical presence.
It doesn't have a physical presence and your name isn't tied to it. If it can be found out, like they can use threats of violence against you.
Have you guys watched Ozark?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Well, it's this show about a money launderer. He's like a financial planner / money launderer. And in the first season, he steals this guy's safe from a strip club. And he's like, I know what's going to be in the safe. And he uncovers it and the secret bottom pops out and whatever. And he has this certificate. And it's like, this entitles the bearer to all of the funds in this account in Panama. And so the owner of this business set up this bank account that doesn't want it tied to his name at all. So the only thing that can tie it to him is this certificate that he has to walk in and show it to them. I don't know, probably not very practical, but I do wonder about that.
Can you actually set up a bank account like that?
I don't know. In Panama? Maybe.
If you have enough money, probably.
I know that if you walk around Panama or you drive around Panama City, like half the buildings there are international banks.
Well, of course, we heard about the Panama Papers, right?
Yeah, Panama's a big, I guess you could say, tax haven or people laundering money.
I'm going to see if I can get residency there.
Let me know how it goes.
Yeah, my buddy told me it only costs $1,000. You just have to visit once every 2 years.
Wait, really?
That's what I've heard. I'll have to narrow down those details.
Did he say that you can legally work there under that rule too?
Yeah, I guess that would be for work as well. But here's the thing. Foreign income isn't taxed as a Panama resident, but local income is. So do you really want to work there?
True.
Okay. What the tax rates are.
True.
Do you know Ash Oro?
Yeah. I met up with him in Thailand, in Chiang Mai.
Yeah, we go way back. We both hung out in Denver for a while.
Yeah, he was a Panama resident for a few years. He might even still be a Panama resident.
Yeah, he told me he helped set up Euro-Pacific Capital. Or Euro-Pacific Capital or Euro-Pacific Bank?
I think it's Europac Bank. With Peter Schiff.
Yeah.
Which I think is also in Puerto Rico.
Right. Yeah, because they moved all their things there and all the employees don't have to pay taxes now.
Yeah, except for to Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico has an income tax, but there's no federal income tax.
Okay.
So there's no federal capital gains tax in Puerto Rico?
There's no federal income tax. I don't know about capital gains.
Capital gains, well, maybe it's different in the U.S. Isn't capital gains just part of the income tax?
That's what I thought. I thought it was a type of income.
Capital gains taxes, the rates are completely separate. It's handled a different way.
Well, I know short-term capital gains are treated as regular income for tax purposes. Like you categorize them as short-term capital gains, but then the rates are exactly the same as for income.
Oh, okay. So income is the broad category and capital gains is a type of income tax.
Right. And only long-term capital gains are taxed at a lower rate than regular income.
I see. I'll have to consult my tax attorney. I recommend you all do the same.
Yes.
Of course we are.
We're not tax advice. This is
Actually,
not financial advice. This is not legal advice.
Actually, like in all seriousness, I have a pretty good accountant. If you guys need somebody that's good with crypto accounting, I can refer you.
Cool.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people who crypto on IRS this year just because it's losses, not gains. So why wouldn't they?
Yeah, exactly. Let's report it all.
That seems like a good way to let the IRS know that you have crypto when they didn't know before.
Yeah. They probably know if you bought it, like unless you bought it through some sort of obfuscated method, then chain analysis means that, like, if you bought it through Coinbase, the IRS almost certainly knows about it.
Right.
Bought it on any KYC exchange.
Well, and the other thing is, like, if you're making small transactions, just spending your crypto on coffee here and there, then nobody's going to care. But if you buy like a car or a house with your crypto and you don't report where that income came from, they're going to come after you.
What if you declare that you invest into some scammy ICOs, they did not have any KYC AML process whatsoever, and you just lost everything? There are so many good ICOs for that.
Just like those terrible boating accidents that seem to happen with regularity.
Yeah.
You know, speaking of borders, we could probably talk a little bit about how crypto integrates these exchanges that are online and how borders influence which exchanges you use.
Yeah, that's a super important aspect of crypto. Exchanges are the on-ramp to crypto, but you have to find an exchange that is operating legally in the currency that you want to buy the crypto with. Coinbase has done a good job, and some other exchanges too have done a good job of getting regulated in all 50 states and maybe a whole bunch of other countries and basically getting a license as a money transmitter. But there are a lot of countries that have really restrictive money transmission laws. And so there are basically like one exchange that you can use for that country because, that's the only exchange where they're actually willing to put in the effort to follow all the regulations for that country.
Do you guys ever use Bisq?
I can neither confirm nor deny.
I've looked at it, but I've never done a trade on there. This was like early days. I tried it out and I was like, I gotta like put cash into a bank account. It's similar to how they do it on local Bitcoins, right? Where you like bring cash to a bank and you deposit into some account and then it just kind of goes out into the ether and then your coins magically appear or something.
Based on what I've read about Bisq and based on what my friends have told me about Bisq, essentially it's the only 100% decentralized exchange. In terms of how you exchange and what you exchange, it's actually kind of open. So you pay a little bit in terms of speed, so it's not the fastest process. However, for example, let's suppose I downloaded Bisq, I could make a trade in US dollars for, say, Monero. 90% of the transactions on Bisq are for Monero. But what I could do is like, okay, let's suppose I want to buy some Monero. I might actually mail some cash wherever someone gives me some instructions. Say, hey, mail the cash here, and then I'll give you Monero. Or they might give me some banking instructions. They might say, okay, wire the money to this location, and then you'll get the Monero. The way they prevent fraud is that there's a moderator, there's a mediator there that gets a very small percentage. And so essentially, if I can prove that I sent the cash, like suppose over wire, and I can show, okay, here's the proof of the wire transaction, I sent it to the account that he said, and here's the proof that it actually executed. Once the mediator sees that, right, if I don't get paid and I show that to the mediator, they'll say, no, basically the mediator is going to release the funds to me because it's held in I think in a multi-sig account. But not so much is done from fiat to crypto on Bisq. Primarily, it's from Bitcoin to Monero for obvious reasons. Bisq actually automatically connects to Tor, to the dark web. So it's designed to be both private and fully decentralized. The only thing, like I said, is there's a bit of a time delay factor. There's about 24 hours that as soon as I initiate a transaction, I'm going to handle my part of that. And then the counterparty has 24 hours to initiate and complete their side of that. There's very little fraud that occurs on there. And even if people did try again, that's why there's a third-party mediator. So it's got its positives, it's got its negatives, but if you really want a truly decentralized, anonymous exchange, Bisq is definitely the way to go. It's probably the best thing out there so far.
Talking about countries and exchanges, Kraken recently posted their information on 2018, how many law enforcement requests they've got. So overall, they've got 475 and 320 of them from the United States.
Who is this? Sorry?
Kraken.
Oh, Kraken. Okay.
Yeah. And they're like, yeah, now you can see why most of the exchanges trying to avoid the United States customers because it's very expensive.
Really, if you're trying to buy crypto anonymously, I would probably just go to the community. I would go to a conference somewhere. I would just do some kind of OTC and just try and avoid the exchanges entirely. At this point, I'm kind of concerned about the exchanges and how much they're hurting the crypto community. That's true. Like they're on-ramps, but a lot of the things that I see exchanges doing are shady and questionable. And I wonder how much it's actually hurting crypto at the moment.
It's helping and it's hurting. They're definitely necessary if there's going to be any kind of adoption because most people aren't going to go to conferences and do a hand-to-hand trade.
Yeah, that's a good point. The one thing I would really like to see the crypto community move away from holding their crypto on exchanges and trading it on exchanges and instead hold it in their own wallets.
Have you heard about the January 3rd proof of keys thing?
Yeah, Katy had a good point about that, actually.
I saw people putting it in their Twitter handles, and I didn't know what it was. And then I saw Juan's post about it, and I was like, oh, people are planning to do some kind of
run on the exchanges.
Yeah, run on the exchanges on January 3rd. I didn't hear anything about it, though, and I didn't participate, so.
Yeah, it kind of came and went without. Katya, what was your take on that? What did you say about that?
Yeah, so this movement was around since like end of November 2018. So we had like 1.5 months to spread the information within the community. But what's funny, the real communities, the core communities, do not have their crypto on exchanges when you don't know your private key. And that's where we spread the information. But then the newbies, they never heard of this January 3rd movement at all whatsoever. So we didn't have enough time to spread this information. But maybe next January 3rd is going to work out.
I didn't hear anyone talk about it until the day, or maybe like the day before.
I like what you said about maybe next year it'll be more of a success. I think if we make it like a permanent holiday, I mean, obviously it's Genesis Block Day already. And if we just say, okay, it's Genesis Block Day and also withdraw your funds from the exchanges day, then I think it'll catch on if we keep doing it every year.
Yeah, maybe it needed more publicity. Yeah, we can make it like an annual holiday, pull your money off the exchanges.
Yeah.
Another point of it is like when you withdraw your money from the exchanges really avoid any kind of audit, and they might just not have enough funds for this. So when we do it all together, we're going to just clear out from the bad exchanges, from the bad players.
Right. And the exchanges are going to know if they're having problems
resolve
them before that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So basically, crypto veterans don't keep their money on exchanges. Traders need the exchanges, and then noobs don't know any better.
Yeah, and noobs don't have hardware wallets, so they're just going to buy the crypto and they're going to leave it on the exchange. So.
My thinking on this, if you really want to be a trader in crypto, you're much better off getting on BitMex. And I think there's some confusion surrounding BitMex and what it is. It is an exchange, but it's not a crypto exchange. It's a futures trading platform. Essentially, a future or a derivative is just a gamble on the future price of an underlying asset. Right. So BitMex doesn't actually set the price of Bitcoin, and they don't actually trade fiat. They don't trade any crypto except for Bitcoin. So what you do is you deposit Bitcoin with them to establish an account, and then all of the bets, all of the gambles that are made are all settled in Bitcoin. So they only deal with Bitcoin, and the reference price that they use for these derivatives exchanges are all based on external platforms. I think they use Kraken, Coinbase, and one other exchange that they use as an index for the underlying value of the asset. But all you're doing is like maybe Chris and I want to make a gamble, and I say, okay, Chris, I bet you 10 Bitcoin that the US dollar price of Bitcoin rises $400 before it falls $400. And you say, okay, I'll take the opposite end of that trade. So what we'll do is agree to some sort of reference, right? Maybe we'll just use the Coinbase price, and then whoever wins that gamble is going to win 10 Bitcoins. So even though the price of Bitcoin only moved $400, I just won, maybe I win. Of course I'll win.
Right, exactly. So you're trading on leverage.
Exactly. So that's a way of trading on what people call leverage. But I've seen on Facebook, I've seen it in places where people get confused. They say, oh, well, it's partial, it's fractional reserve Bitcoin, and they're inflating or they're crushing the price of Bitcoin by printing more value than is there. It's like, no. It's a gamble that we wrote down on contract, and it's a gamble that's settled only in Bitcoin. So it's not actually an exchange in the traditional way that Coinbase is an exchange.
Wait, okay, so I didn't know that. So BitMex is kind of... You're making it sound like it's not custodial, like it's decentralized, where the parties are dealing directly with each other.
They are custodial. So BitMex is the platform that connects parties together. So it is custodial, but it's not an actual exchange in the terms that you're not ever trading US dollars. You're not actually trading Bitcoin for Litecoin or whatever.
It's more like a poker table than a...
Yeah, it's a poker table mediated by a dealer. That's exactly right. The other thing is that depending on where you live, your jurisdiction, it might actually have tax implications for you that are beneficial. If you're trading on a traditional exchange, cryptos, it's quite possible that your tax liability will be much higher than if you're trading derivatives on BitMex. And of course, BitMex is actually banned for US residents or US citizens. They don't want us escaping the farm, of course. As actually Tone Vase found this out recently. So he was trading on BitMex, and so he made some like Twitter posts about BitMex and how he uses it, and then BitMex figured out what his account was, and they're like, yeah, you have like 48 hours to withdraw your funds or some very short amount of time. So at least they let him withdraw his funds, but yeah, you got to use a VPN or get on the Tor network or something like that.
Yeah, I heard him talking about that.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we've reached the 2-hour mark. Does anybody want to add any final comments about borders and nation states and cryptocurrency?
But cryptocurrency borders, Lightning Network is going to destroy cryptocurrency borders by enabling atomic cross-chain transactions.
Exactly. Like where your head's at.
One thing I didn't mention before, here in the EU, like when I flew from Greece to Hungary, I got into the airport and I was like, where's the immigration? And they're like, no, you don't need that. We don't have that here.
One day
flew from Switzerland to France, and I got off the plane and I saw my friends waiting for me outside the door, and I thought, can I just walk out? And I thought I was breaking all the rules. Left the airport, and that was it. Just just got off
So
the
it's
plane
like-
and walked outside.
It feels like a free world already, a little bit. We still got a way to go, but
No, it couldn't have been. There's no way it could have been free, because if they were, then there would have been terrorism trying to attack their freedom.
Right.
Because they hate them for their freedom.
Yes.
All right, guys. Thanks, everybody who showed up. That was a wonderful discussion. I can always count on you guys for some truth bombs and some good advice and, a great discussion. So,
Good times.
all right. Speak up to hippies.
So
Check it.
long.
Bye.
Bye.